to see Sima Qian's History of China from page 101 on, from chapter 4. Okay, let us see how it is looking. Just a moment. Just a Okay, superb. Where is the right place? Just okay, superb. Okay. Chapter 4. The form of the Shi. Western historians from Herodotus on have, for the most part, been content with simple chronological order for the form of their narrative. In recent years, a minor variation in which social, economic, and cultural developments in each period are dealt with in succeeding chapters or sections has become popular as the concept of history broadens to include more than the narration of political events that was the core of older histories. The earliest Chinese histories likewise followed the seemingly most natural of forms. The various speeches, ordinances, and other documents which make up the Book of Documents conform to chronological order, while the spring and autumn annals, being a year by year, sometimes month by month record of events, is the prototype of Chinese Pianian or chronological histories. But the two historical works, which by traditional dating follow the spring and autumn annals, the narratives from the states, Kyoyu, and the intrigues of the warring states, Chan Kuotse, at least in their present form, depart from overall chronological order by arranging their material in chapters devoted to the histories of single feudal states, though within these chapters the order is chronological. It was already realized, it would seem, that the complex affairs of a number of political units existing simultaneously could not be dealt with satisfactorily in the framework of a single overall chronological order. We do not know enough about the original form of the Stowe commentary on the spring and autumn annals to state definitely how it fits into this course of development. But the reader who attempts to read through it in its present form, in which all the events of the various states have been broken up and appended to dated entries of the Luke, will realize the disadvantages of the chronological form in dealing with the history of this period. The narrative jumps back and forth with baffling suddenness from the events of one state to another, while the recital of a single chain of events in one state is broken up and scattered by the overriding dictates of the Luke chronology. If the Chinese historian were not, like Herodotus, to allow himself long digressions to fill in background and considerable freedom in disposition of material, it was obvious that he must find some more suitable form to deal with the complex history of a broad and disunited China. This was one of the major problems confronting Sima Qian in his in the writing of his history of the entire part of his country. Sorry, past of his country. His solution was hailed as a masterpiece of creation and quickly became the model for the main tradition of later Chinese historical writing. To the Chinese, particularly to the men of the Han, with their hierarchical concept of society and the natural world, form is synonymous with meaning. The extent to which this idea has been applied to the forms of literature in China is hard for the Western mind to imagine. Much of the Chinese search for meaning in the form is sorry, much of the Chinese search for meaning in the form and order of their ancient literature strikes us as fanciful and forced. But it must be remembered that this concept did exist at least by the time of the Han Dynasty, and that if attempts to read meaning into the form of pre-Han works seems questionable, such attempts applied to the works of writers who were themselves believers in the concept cannot so easily be dismissed. This practice of describing meaning in form was given full expression in the interpretations of the spring and autumn annals. The Qian commentary, for example, considers significant not only the points of beginning and end of the chronicle, but the exact order of the wording throughout. Under the first entry in the annals, for instance, first year, spring, the king's first month, it comments in its usual catechizing form. Why does it say first year? Because this is the first year of the Lord, that is, Duke Yin of Lu. Why does it say spring? Because this is the beginning of the year. Who is meant by the king? This means King Wen, ancestral founder of the Chow dynasty. Why does it first mention the king and after that the first month? Because it is the first month of the king. What is meant by the first month of the king? The great single beginning, that is, the unity and continuity of the ruling house of Chow, which proclaims the calendar for all the feudal states. This sort of minute attention to the wording, order, and form of the chronicle continues through the entire commentary. Later commentaries have carried this search for meaning in the form of the annals to absurd lengths, even attempting to relate the 12 dukes of Lu treated in the annals to the 12 months of the year. Similar attempts have been made to discover symbolic meaning in the form of the odes and documents. The next important work, which by its form lends itself to this type of symbolic interpretation, is the Lu Shi Chun Chiu, a collection of moral and political essays written by a group of itinerant scholars under the patronage of Lu Wei, the powerful prime minister of the first emperor of the Qin. The title, Chun Chiu, Spring and Autumn, an abbreviation of spring, summer, autumn, winter, that is, years, originally designated a court chronicle of one of the feudal states. తలుపు తీసి పెట్టుకునే ఆ తలుపు నీకు తీసుకుంటే ఏదైనా సలదన వస్తుంది సరే నాకు అయ్యేది చాలా సెట్ అవుతుంది సరే The title Chongqiu, Spring and Autumn, an abbreviation of spring, summer, autumn, winter, that is years, originally designated a court chronicle of one of the feudal states. Here, however, it is being used in a metaphorical sense. Since the work is in no sense a chronicle of historical events, we must assume that it was named Spring and Autumn to mark it as a work of moral and political principles, such as the Spring and Autumn Annals of Confucius was by this time interpreted to be. The form of the book further bears out this supposition. It is in three large sections. The first section is divided into 12 chapters, each of which begins with a description of the rights and functions of government appropriate to one month of the year. Therefore, this section has been taken to represent the first member of the Chinese Trinity, heaven, whose number is 12. The 12 chapters are further divided into five subsections each, suggesting the five elements which govern the workings of heaven. The second large section is divided into eight chapters with eight subsections each, eight being the number assigned to the second member of the Trinity. This section has been taken to represent the affairs of earth. The third section is in chapters. Sorry, the third section is in six chapters of six subsections, six being the number of the third member of the Trinity, man. Such an arrangement seems too ordered to be accidental, and we must admit that here the Chinese symbolists are sound in their interpretation. Similar attempts which have been made to relate the sections of the Shi Qi either to those of this work or to astrology and numerology appear less than convincing. But if Suma Qian did not actually adopt the number symbolism of the Lu Shi Chun Xiu, its precedent of significant form undoubtedly influenced the plan of his own work. However, whereas the form of the Lu Shi Chun Xiu represents symbolic concepts, the actual contents of its various divisions, with a few exceptions, seems to be quite arbitrarily distributed. Its form is superficially imposed and does not spring internally from the nature of its material. Suma Chen, on the other hand, by sacrificing superficial symbolism to the demands of his material, managed, by careful arrangement of the content of his various divisions, to give inner significance to his form. The Shi Chi is divided into five sections: basic annals, Pen Chi, 12 chapters, chronological tables, Piao, 10 chapters, treatises, Shu, 8 chapters, hereditary houses, Shijia, 30 chapters, memoirs, Lie Chuan, 70 chapters. This form is so radically different from the general Western concept of the form of a history that it demands considerable explanation. The significance of the various sections and the effect which this form has upon the organization and usefulness of the work as a whole may best be conveyed, I believe, by imagining a history of America composed in this way. If the reader will bear with the fancifulness of this idea and the obvious discrepancies between the history of China and America, I shall try to outline what such a work might be like. The basic annals would be devoted to the lives of men who exercised authority over a large section of the country. If England were considered as the dominant power of colonial times, we would expect an annals of English rulers arranged in chronological order and ending with a biting portrait of George III, weak, degenerate, and the victim of evil counselors. There would follow the annals of the presidents. For the less important men, this would be hardly more than a list of names with dates of office. But in the case of more important figures, men who had captured the imagination of their age, such as Washington, Lincoln, and the two Roosevelts, we should have fairly complete biographies, beginning with their childhood, the cherry tree, the log cabin record, in order to indicate the unusual character and determination of these men even in their youth, and concentrating on a few dramatic and significant scenes in their lives. The annals section would be followed by the chronological tables, each introduced by a short essay on the history of the period covered in the table. One table, arranged with dates along the top, would record in parallel cross sections the founding of the various colonies with brief notations of the various governors and rulers of the colonies and the important events of their history. Another table would do the same thing for the various states created from the old territories. A third would list vice presidents and important cabinet ministers with dates of office in relation to the various presidents. Others, divided month by month instead of year by year, would note in the form of graphs the major battles and events of the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. Next would follow a series of treatises on political, economic, social, and cultural themes. These would include sections on the economic history of America, the development of canals and railroads, recording for purposes of illustration, folk songs such as Erie Canal or I Have Been Working on the Railroad, the religious history of the colonies of the nation, science, warfare, music. Here would appear the text of Yankee Doodle, the Star Spangled Banner, My Country, It Is of Thee, etc., and any other subjects that the historian felt needed to be discussed separately. As in other sections, however, the emphasis would be upon the men who did most for the advancement of the nation in each field rather than on abstract discussions of the subject itself. The next section, colonies and territories, the Shichis, hereditary houses, would be devoted to brief histories of the various colonies on the American continent. These would relate the founding of each colony with special attention to the life and personality of the founders, the Pilgrim Fathers, William Penn, etc., and would follow the history of the colony up to its incorporation into the Union. While most of these would end with the Revolutionary War, some, such as those dealing with the Louisiana Territory, Alaska, and Hawaii, would continue into later times and even down to the present. Included would be a chapter relating to the unhappy story of Jefferson Davis and his Confederacy. Finally, would follow a series of short chapters devoted for the most part to individuals. The first chapter would relate the story of Leif Erikson with speculations upon the reliability of his legend and general remarks on the difficulties of writing history. Then would come short biographies of outstanding statements of the colonies, early explorers, generals of the Revolutionary War, etc. Some already mentioned in previous sections, some appearing for the first time, arranged more or less in chronological order. Other chapters, chronological order grows to pieces here, would discuss important statesmen Franklin, Paine, Seward, men of letters, Emerson, Hawthorne, Poe, with quotations from their works. Thinkers Cotton Mather, Emerson, Dewey, Generals Jackson, Lee, Pershing, MacArthur, Patriots Paul Revere, Betsy Ross, Barbara Frietchie. One chapter would discuss the influence upon history of presidents' wives with sketches of Martha Washington, Dolly Madison, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Another would be devoted to great financiers Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Gold, Ford, Rockefeller. Several chapters would describe Indian tribes, Mexico, and Canada, and the relations between the American government and these peoples and lands. Others might be devoted to famous inventors Morse, Edison, the Wright brothers, to the movie industry with lives of outstanding actors, to Western pioneers and outlaws, etc. The work would end with an autobiography of the historian and a brief exposition of his aims and methods in composing his work. I shall not attempt to elaborate this fantasy any further. I hope I have indicated, however, something of the peculiar arrangement within such a form. Sorry, which such a form. So I'll begin from paragraph. I shall not attempt to elaborate this fantasy any further. I hope I have indicated, however, something of the peculiar arrangement which such a form imposes upon the material of history. The arrangement has obvious advantages from the historian's point of view. He may shuffle his material around so that in the midst of a discussion of railroads, for example, he need not explain in detail who Jay Gould is, since Gould has a biography in another section of his work. In a narrative of the Revolutionary War, he need not bother with the dubious tales of Paul Revere or Betsy Ross, which he has treated elsewhere. In a discussion of the opening of the West, he may refer to Indian tribes without explanation, since they are the subject of special treatment. Whereas Herodotus must digress from his main narrative when he wishes to relate the tale of Arion and the dolphin, or outline the ancient history of Egypt. Soma Qian can simply shift such material to other sections of his work, and in doing so, convey by the place in which he puts it something of his opinion of its importance and reliability. But the Shi Chi is provided with no index, and although a few simple cross references are found, the unwary reader who tries to dip into it for a particular set of facts is apt, if he is not careful, to be led awfully astray. Let us suppose that with a hypothetical history of America in the Shi Chi form as a source, we wish to make a study of the Civil War. In the annals of Lincoln and Grant, we get a good start from the point of view of the federal government. But to learn the southern side of the question, we must turn at once to the chapter of Jefferson Davis, where we discover that this was not a civil war at all, but a war of secession. Furthermore, the annals of Grant records only his career as president, while his military exploits are to be found in the biographies of Lee and other important generals of the war. While other biographies give us vital information on the statesmen of the period, we must consult the treatises for an understanding of the economic background of the war and the question of slavery. A reading of the colonies and territories is necessary to understand the question of admission of free and slave states into the Union. Finally, the chronological tables on the war will give us an outline of the progress of the war and occasional information we could not find elsewhere. Chinese critics have described the Shi Chi form as one of the greatest creations of historiography. The scholar trying to get at all the relative facts on a particular subject might be more inclined to describe it as a monstrosity which deliberately obscures the flow and relationships of history. But the Shi Chi was not designed to be dipped into or thumbed through for facts. It is a unified work constructed on a grand plan that does not, in the opinion of the Chinese, disrupt or confuse the materials of history, but on the contrary, brings to them a hierarchical order that in the simple chronicle form they lack. Through its form, the history passes judgment upon its material. It is worthwhile, therefore, to examine in detail the elements of this masterpiece of form and see how they work. We are now at page 108, basic annals. Basic annals, page 108. Of the affairs that I have discussed and examined, I have made a general survey of the three dynasties and a record of the Qian and Han, extending in all back as far as the Yellow Emperor and coming down to the present, set forth in the 12 basic annals. Like some of the other formal divisions of the Shichi, this, or at least its name, Basic Annals, does not seem to have been original with Suma Qian, for at the end of volume 123 upon 43, we find mention of an old Basic Annals of You. As pointed out by commentators, pen or basic indicates that these chapters deal with the rulers and ruling families of the nation as a whole, and Chi or annals calls attention to the fact that more than in other sections of the Shi Chi, the narrative follows strict chronological form, though in the earlier chapters it is by no means a year by year account. The first chapter, the basic annals of the five emperors, has been the subject of much controversy. Suma Qian was well aware of the controversial nature of his material, for at the end of the chapter he went to lengths to explain why he began his history with the first of the five emperors, the Yellow Emperor, when the Confucian classic, the Book of Documents, went back no farther than the fourth of the five emperors, Emperor Yao. Why did Suma Qian extend the scope of his history beyond classical sources? Several reasons have been suggested. The first is that Sima Qian, like his father, was a Taoist and as such honored the Yellow Emperor as the founder of his creed. But this whole charge of Taoist sympathies, as I shall show later, has been greatly exaggerated. Chavannes quite rightly rejects this explanation, but remarks instead that the Shi Chi begins with the Yellow Emperor because of the theory of the five elements, yellow being the color of earth, the first of the five elements. It is clear that at the time of the great calendar reform of BC 104, the Han dynasty chose the element earth with its color yellow as the element which it should honor. But there seems to have been no attempt to relate this decision to the figure of the Yellow Emperor. There is, for example, no suggestion that the Liu family was descended from the Yellow Emperor, as it was later declared that it was descended from Emperor Yao, the Fire Emperor, when the Han rulers changed their mind and chose fire as their patron element. If Chavannes intended by his statement to imply a direct relationship between the adoption of the element earth by the early Han and the fact that the Shi Chi begins with the early emperor, Yellow Emperor, it is hard to go along with his opinion. As a matter of fact, Suma Qian, as I have said, explains at the end of his chapter exactly why he recorded the reigns of these early emperors, namely, because he found them recorded thus in his sources, which he considered reliable. He might have begun his account even earlier with the vague figures of Fu Si and Shen Nung, which were obviously known to him, but he either doubted their existence as historical figures or felt he did not have enough reliable material to say anything about them. Suma Qian, as he himself says, based his chapter on two early texts, the virtues of the five emperors and the successions of the emperors. These two texts were apparently part of the ritual expounded by Master Su, a Confucian scholar of the time of Emperor Wen, which later, in the time of Emperor Xuan, after Xian's death, took form as the Ta Tai Li Chi, or collected ritual of Tai the Elder. This collection of ritual texts, however, was soon replaced in favor by a similar one, the Li Chi, or collected ritual as we know it today. The Lichi did not include the two texts used by Soma Qian as the basis for his account of the early rulers. Later writers have accordingly criticized Qian for using texts which are not canonical. There is no indication, however, that in Qian's time these texts were either more or less canonical than others, since the question of what was canonical had not yet been decided. As Qian states, some scholars of his day did not accept these two texts, but these men were merely following a different tradition of the ritual texts from the one Qian accepted. One may question Qian's judgment as a historian in utilizing such texts, but it is both irrelevant and unfair to introduce the question of canonicity. After comparing these texts with others of undisputed authority and with oral traditions as he knew them, Suma Qian accepted the texts as reliable, and that was all that interested him. There was a special reason why Qian, with his usual interest in genealogy, should desire to begin his history with the Yellow Emperor. According to tradition, most of the rulers of later dynasties were descended from the Yellow Emperor. Emperor Yu, founder of the Xia dynasty, was a great great grandson of the Yellow Emperor, while the rulers of the Qin dynasty were descended from Emperor Xuanzu, a grandson of the Yellow Emperor. Although the ancestors of both the Yin and Shao are in the annals reportedly born of miraculous conceptions, the ancestors of the Yin conceived after eating a swallow's egg, that of the Chow after stepping into the traces of a giant. Both ladies were consorts of Emperor Gu, a great grandson of the Yellow Emperor. As Chu Shaosan ponderously explains in an addition to Shi Chi 13, The progeny of these miraculous births were actually the natural descendants of the Yellow Emperor, being only spiritually born of the gods. Qian had already indicated he attached no literal meaning to the miraculous conceptions by listing both men as descendants of the Yellow Emperor in his chronological table of the three dynasties Shi Chi 13. So it was of special importance that Sima Qian should begin with the earliest historical personage in his judgment from whom all these illustrious families of later history had sprung. The annals of the five emperors are followed by those of the Xia, Yin, and Zhou dynasties, and those of the state of Qin in two parts. The first part covering the history of the rulers of Qin up to the time they became masters of all China, the second part relating their fortunes as emperors. Some commentators have criticized the fact that in these basic annals chapters, Suma Qian relates the history of the Zhou and Qin ancestors before they became rulers of the empire. There are, I think, two reasons why he chose to place this material here. First, he was interested in genealogy and the fortunes of one family. It was therefore important, in his view, to trace a ruling family not from the time it acquired actual power, but from the time it first manifested signs of worth and eminence to emphasize the continuity of the heritage of virtue. Second, in the hierarchical order of the various sections of the Shichi, the annals naturally occupy the highest place. In this conception of history, it would be unseemly to have to search for the account of the beginnings of a dynastic family among the pages of the hereditary houses or memoirs. The annals of Qin are followed by those of the Chu general Xiang Yu. This chapter also has been the source of much dispute. Xiang Yu was a military dictator, but never an ordained emperor, and critics contend that his story has no place among the annals which they believe should be reserved for emperors. But Sima Qian had no such definition in mind when he compiled his annals. He called them basic annals. It was later historians who changed the name and hence the interpretation to imperial annals, Tichi, and critics have been led by this interpretation to berate Suma Qian for failing to conform to a rule he never recognized. Xiang Yu was for a period the de facto ruler of most of China, and Xian, with his customary realism, recognized this fact by placing his story in the section of actual rulers, the annals. He further demonstrated the fact that his basic annals were not synonymous with imperial annals by omitting the record of two emperors, the rulers Emperor I of Chu and Emperor Hui of the Han. Emperor Yi was a puppet created and later destroyed by Xiang Liu, while Emperor Hui was a powerless figurehead set up by Empress Lu, who continued to exercise actual rule. Therefore, Qian realistically ignored the de jure monarchs and included the accounts of their brief reigns in the chapters of the persons who wielded the real power, Xiang Yu and Empress Lu. But such realism is a rare thing in historical writing. Pan Ku, more concerned, it seems, with the name and form of imperial rule than the reality, created a separate annals for the Han Emperor Hui. The ingenious formal plan, which Suma Qian designed to express and emphasize the realities of history, was more often used by his successors as a facade to conceal reality. One has only to glance at the great Japanese work patterned on the Shichi, the Daini Hongshi, with its large, dreary succession of annals of emperors who were in actual fact powerless non-entities, while the real rulers, the shoguns, are crowded off into a corner of the memoirs to realize what an imposture the Shichi form can become when it is not used honestly. Goodness. It's hurting so hard is for a while. Okay, I'm going to shift the position. This is very uncomfortable. சொல்றா Bluetooth earphones. 1 second, my lord. Table மேல Bluetooth earphones இல்லையே. மாமா தூங்கிட்டாங்க. இங்க எங்கேயும் இல்ல. இது கீழே எங்கேயாவது இருந்திருக்காங்க. கீழேயும் எங்கேயும் இல்ல. நாளைக்கு பார்க்கறியா? சார்ஜர் தான் இருக்கு இங்க. Headphones இல்ல. Okay. Oh, it's automatically closing, probably because of the call. Okay, page 112. He further demonstrated the fact that his basic annals were not synonymous with imperial annals by omitting the record of two emperors, the rulers Emperor Yi of Chu and Emperor Hui of the Han. Emperor Yi was a puppet created and later destroyed by Xiang Yu, while Emperor Hui was a powerless figurehead set up by Empress Lu, who continued to exercise actual rule. Therefore, Qian realistically ignored the de jure monarchs and included the accounts of their brief reigns in the chapters of the persons who wielded the real power, Xiang Yu and Empress Lu. But such realism is a rare thing in historical writing. Pan Ku, more concerned, it seems, with the name and form of imperial rule than the reality, created a separate annals for the Han Emperor Hui. The ingenious formal plan which Suma Qian designed to express and emphasize the realities of history was more often used by his successors as a facade to conceal reality. One has only to glance at the great Japanese work pattern on the Shichi Dai Dainihonshi, with its long, dreary succession of annals of emperors who were in actual fact powerless non-entities, while the real rulers, the shoguns, are crowded off into a corner of the memoirs to realize what an imposture the Shichi form can become when it is not used honestly. Chronological tables. After this had been put in order and completed, because there were differences in chronology for the same periods and the dates were not always clear, I made the 10 chronological tables. The chronological tables of the Shichi have been justly praised as a masterful idea. In the form of graphs, the tables record the important events of pre Han and Han political history. Most of them consist of a series of dated columns which list the important accessions, battles, depositions, and deaths that occurred in the various feudal states. Others, such as those of the Han peers, reverse the form by listing at the top of the columns the names of the various fiefs while noting below in chronological order the men who held them. Later historians have admired the patience and efficiency with which Soma Qian unscrambled the confused chronologies of the feudal states and arranged them in terms of the chronology of the ruling Chow house. As Qian himself remarks, the chronological records of these feudal states were never, like the classics and philosophical writings, the possession of private families, but were kept in the archives of the Chow capital. When the Qing assumed full control of the nation, it destroyed all these chronicles because they contained deprecatory references, preserving only its own chronicle of Qin. Suma Qian, therefore, had at his disposal only this Qin chronicle, which has been appended by Xian or later editors to the end of Shi Qi 6 and that of Lu, the Spring and Autumn Annals, with its commentaries. He was thus forced to chase back and forth among these and other scattered materials at hand to try to reduce his narrative to some sort of unified chronological order. When we remember that these materials were usually recorded in terms of varying local term chronologies, we can appreciate some of the difficulties which confronted him in his labors. As might be expected, there are still discrepancies to be found between dates in the chronological tables and those recorded in other chapters of the Shichi. But as Professor Okazaki has suggested, these may not represent actual errors or oversights on the historian's part. Rather, they may be due to the fact that, with typical Chinese respect for sources, Suma Qian did not presume to alter errors in the texts which he was copying verbatim into his annals and hereditary houses, but reserved his corrections for the chapters of his own composition, the chronological tables. If this theory is true, it is but another indication of the care and thoroughness with which the scholar must approach a work so far removed from the traditions of Western historiography as the Shichi. The many brief entries in these chronological tables sometimes contain facts not to be found anywhere else in the Shichi. The Qing scholar Chao Wan or Chao Yi has singled out this aspect for special praise. In the case of important officials who were without either great merit or fault, he writes, Suma Qian did not feel they warranted separate biographies, and yet he was unwilling to ignore them completely, so he recorded them in the chronological tables. In the form created by the historian, nothing is more admirable than this. As Chavannes has remarked, the form of the chronological tables was the creation of Qian himself. Although this form may have been suggested to him by the genealogical tables of the Chow period, nothing to compare with these chapters in design and elaborateness is known to have existed before the Shi Chi. It is customary to praise the concept of time, which the historian displayed in arranging all the events of history in terms of a single chronology. But as Takeda Taijin has pointed out, it is not merely the temporal order of events that the tables illustrate, but their spatial relationships. The spring and autumn annals, with its commentaries, for example, achieves a fine temporal unity by subjecting all events of the various feudal states to the Lu chronology, but achieves this by destroying the continuity of the narrative for events relating to all other parts of China. By creating separate lines for the events of each state, the sheet sheet tables allow us not only to read down the columns to see what each state was doing in any given year, but also to read across and see the course of development within any given state. Many pre-hand works had shown great competence in dealing with the history of single political units. It was Suma Qian who, by frequent cross references and particularly by his tables, attempted to bring these histories of individual states into spatial as well as temporal relationships with each other. Relationship with each other. Special mention should be made of the brief introductions which precede most of these tables. In these little essays, Soma Chen often displays his most interesting and original thinking. Some are concerned with problems of the completeness and accuracy of his sources. Others are short philosophical treatises on such historical themes as the downfall of the Chow, the rise and fall of Qin, the sudden rise of the Han, the feudal system of the Chow and the Han, or relations with the Xingnu. For a rare moment, he breaks away from his sources, steps back, and contemplates the broad panorama of history. Sometimes he chides men of his time who jump to superficial conclusions on the course of history, volume 15 upon 6, or throws out a novel theory such as that new dynasties arise from the West, volume 15 upon 4. As is his custom, he does not labor over or develop his ideas, but moves with frustrating rapidity from point to point, corrupting misconceptions, lamenting the lack of reliable sources, or sighing over the pattern of rise and decay that dominates all history. A glance at the handshoe tables will help to show, by contrast, the liveliness and originality of Chien's writing. Though Panku borrowed an occasional phrase from his predecessor, the introductions to his tables are for the most part original. Like Chien, he begins his discussions with the most ancient times, tracing the development of feudal institutions down through the ages. In places, he achieves a clear, moving rhetoric that is in its majestic effect superior to Chien's rapid, laconic style. Example, Hanshu 16 upon 3b, the fine passage on the downfall of the peers. But by later hand times, the Chinese concept of the past had become hardened into conventional Confucian molds. Panku's essays are classical, stately, and dull. There is no longer any suggestion that there may be controversy over the interpretation of history or that new interpretations are possible. The past is a closed story, and all that remains for the historian is to summarize it in fine stereotyped phrases. Treatises, page 115, treatises. Of the change in rites and music, the improvements and revisions of the pitch pipes and calendar, military power, mountains and rivers, spirits and gods, the relationships of heaven and man, and the faulty economic practices handed down and reformed through the years, I have made the eight treatises. The treatises have also been praised as an invaluable contribution to historical form. Qian had as a model for these a number of short texts or chapters of longer works devoted to similar subjects, such as Sun Tzu's essays on rites and music. Unfortunately, some of the Shichi essays are in a rather confused and obviously unfinished state, but a reading of at least the last three, those on the Feng and Shan sacrifices, rivers and canals, and economics, the balanced standard, serve to give an idea of what he intended the form to be. In these, the historian traces briefly the historical background of his subject and then proceeds to a detailed account of Han affairs relating to it. In many ways, the subjects of these chapters were closer to Qian himself than those of any other sections of his history. The Feng and Shang sacrifices deals with the sacrifices and religious affairs of the Emperor Wu, which Xian and his father knew personally from their long attendance upon the emperor. The chapter on rivers and canals reaches its climax in the description of how the emperor himself, with his ministers, among them Xian, labored to repair the break in the dikes of the Yellow River at Utsu. The treatise on the calendar relates matters which were the official concern of Qian and his father in their capacity as grand historian. Suma Qian's decision to deal with such important subjects and subjects in which he possessed more than ordinary knowledge and experience was indeed a happy one, and it is regrettable that at least the first three treatises seem to be in incomplete form. Pan Ku changed the title of the treatises from Shu to Qi, combined some of the subjects Qian had treated in separate chapters, and added new ones. His treatises, in finished form and having the advantage, as he did throughout his work, of Qian's models to draw upon, are much more useful as historical sources. But it should be noted that he was indebted for his material not only to the Shi Qi, but also to Liu Xiang and Liu Xin, whose extensive writings he drew upon in his treatises on the five elements: geography, literature, rites and music, and the musical tubes and the calendar. His only entirely original work seems to be the rather short treatise on the penal code. Another difference between the treatises of the two historians has often been noted. When Sheehan confines himself largely to the affairs of the hand, with only an occasional reference to the history of ancient times in order to illustrate a point, Pan Ku, in true Confucian style, insists upon beginning the discussion of every subject with a dubious and idealized description of ancient times before he gets down to actual Han history. Page 117, Hereditary Houses. As the 28 constellations revolve about the North Star, as the 30 spokes of a wheel come together at the hub, revolving endlessly without stop, so the ministers, assisting like arms and legs, faithful and trustworthy in true moral spirit, serve their Lord and Ruler. Of them I made the 30 hereditary houses. The term hereditary house, Shi Chia, was not original with Suma Qian, but appears in the Mencius, designating a family which holds hereditary rights to some office or benefice in the state. It is possible, therefore, that there were already in existence histories of such hereditary office holding families before Qian compiled the 30 chapters of his history under this title. In form, these chapters differ little from the basic annals. Most of them describe the fortunes of eminent feudal families of pre-Qing times. Like the annals, they begin with a fairly detailed portrait of the illustrious founder of the line, who, because of military merit, outstanding service, or, in the case of descendants of earlier dynasties, the mere fact of noble birth, was enfeoffed under the early Chow. That follows a brief outline of successive holders of the fief, sometimes no more than a bare list of accessions and deaths. As the centuries pass, the virtue and merit which originally distinguished the family wear thin. Unworthy descendants misuse the power inherited from their eminent ancestor, and at last, the state, weak and decadent, succumbs to the attack of some more virile neighbor. This pattern is occasionally elaborated, like that of the annals, by a restoration of power and moral eminence through the efforts of some exceptionally worthy heir. But often, Qian's sources allowed him to give a detailed picture only of the two extremes of the cycle of rise and decay, the illustrious founder and the decadent terminator of the line. The histories of the various feudal states, beginning for the most part with the founding of the Chou dynasty and continuing until the conquest of Qin, run in parallel lines through the same area of time. Qian was concerned, as we have already noted, that the reader, as he followed the narrative of each individual state, should be aware of the relationship of its development to simultaneous developments in other parts of the country. For this reason, he has employed a kind of framework of cross references to important events in the history of the period, which serves to relate each individual history to the others. Brief notations of the move of the Chou capital to the east, the beginning of the ascendancy of Qin, the death of Confucius, or the destruction of Wu, serve to punctuate the history of each little principality and remind one of the great progress of greater changes beyond its borders that will eventually affect its whole existence. In a similar way, the personality of the itinerant nobleman of Wu, Chi Chia, runs like a thread through the histories of the various feudalities as he wanders from state to state, advising its leaders and predicting its future. With the end of the histories of the pre-Qin states, we come to two chapters which have been the subject of much controversy: the hereditary house of Confucius and that of Chen Shi, volumes 47 and 48. Commentators have generally assumed that Sima Qian meant his hereditary houses to be the histories of men and their families who were formerly enfeoffed as feudal lords. By this definition, neither Confucius, according to tradition, a minor official of Lu, nor Chen Shi, a peasant upstart who led a rebellion against the Qin and set himself up as a self styled king, have any place in this category. Some commentators have tried to interpret the fact that Confucius and his descendants appear among the feudal lords as a token of the honor that Suma Qian paid to the sage, referring for support of their interpretation to the theory popular in the Han that Confucius, by the mandate of heaven, if not of the men of his time, was an uncrowned king. Others have pointed out, however, that according to this interpretation, Suma Qian should rightly have put Confucius in the annals among the rulers of the men, not among the lesser peers. Such explanations seem to me to be unconvincing and to contradict the realism with which Qian customarily treated history. Much more pertinent, I believe, is the suggestion of Liao Tengting that those who achieved dominance by grasping power were designated for the basic annals, those who lasted through a long period of time were designated for the hereditary houses. In other words, power is the outstanding characteristic of the men and families of the annals, duration that of those of the hereditary houses. How does this suggestion apply to the two problematical chapters under discussion here? The biography of Confucius ends with the genealogy of his descendants, showing that his family endured through the ages to the writer's own time. In fact, Suma Qian studied with a descendant of Confucius, Kung and Ko. Furthermore, it not only endured as a private family, continuing through the generations to perform sacrifices to its illustrious ancestor, as the ages passed, Confucius came to receive the sacrifices and homage of important officials, nobles, and even emperors as well. Ritualistically, Confucius continued through the ages to receive all due religious obeisance, while culturally he was honored by an increasingly wider group as the father of learning and the final authority in questions of the classics. All the powerful and famous aristocratic families of the Chow had perished in the great social upheavals of the Qin and early Han. Only the descendants and pupils of this humble official of Lu seemed, in Suma Qian's time, to grow more honored with each passing year. The hereditary house of Confucius comes after all the chapters dealing with these pre-Qin families who perished. It marks the emergence of a new group in history, the men whose influence would extend through their heirs and followers into the Han. But if the principle governing the inclusion of families in the hereditary houses is persistence in time, how are we to account for the presence of Chen She, who did not even live out his natural life but was defeated by Qin and murdered by his carriage driver? In this case, Suma Qian, as though anticipating the question, has taken pains to explain his reasons at the end of the chapter. Although Chen She was killed, the nobles and kings, generals and officials whom he set up and employed eventually overthrew the Qin because She had opened the way for them. In the time of Cao Tzu, 30 families were established for Qian Shi as guardians of his grave at Tang, and down to this day, he continues to enjoy the blood and flesh of sacrifices. The spirit of Chen Shi then continued to receive the sacrifices due the ancestor of a noble family. In this most important ritualistic aspect, his line was preserved, and through the men he raised to power, the task which he began in his rebellion was carried on and brought to eventual completion. This was not the work, of course, of his actual descendants. Qian here Qian is here thinking beyond strict lines of blood to the spiritual kinship of men engaged in the same great undertaking, the destruction of Qin. In this respect, the entire House of Han was an heir of the military achievements of Chen Shi, as it was a spiritual heir of Confucius. It is probably with these considerations in mind that Suma Qian placed the biographies of these two men at the head of the hereditary houses of the Han. Suma Qian completed his set of hereditary houses with histories of the statesmen, generals, and imperial relatives who were enfeoffed in the early days of the new dynasty. But though he perhaps did not fully realize it, the old feudal forms were by this time rapidly becoming empty and meaningless. Emperors Qing and Wu worked ceaselessly to whittle away territory and power from these Han peers and their descendants until, by the time of Suma Qian's death, feudalism was in spirit, if not in form, a thing of the past. In his Han Shu, Panku eliminated this category of hereditary houses and shifted the Han peers to the memoirs, and with a few exceptions, this form was never again used in Chinese histories. Okay, memoirs, page 120. Upholding righteousness, masterful and sure, not allowing themselves to miss their opportunities, they made a name for themselves in the world. Of such men, I made the 70 memoirs. Let us turn now to the last and longest section of the Shi Qi, the Lie Chuan or memoirs. As with the other forms of the Shi Qi, there has been much discussion among scholars as to just what Suma Qian meant by his designation, Lie Chuan, and what he conceived as the unifying characteristic of these chapters. It is generally agreed that Lie means arranged, set forth, but the interpretation of the second character presents great difficulties. The term Chuan, transmission, or in its verbal form, Chuan, to transmit, was from early times used by the Confucian school to designate oral or written exegesis of a classical text. Thus, in the case of the spring and autumn annals, the early Confucian school possessed two types of texts. The original classic or Qing, in this case the Chronicle of Lu, and the commentaries of Chuan, explaining the background and exact meaning of entries in the classic. As demonstrated by Professor Naito, this same twofold division of texts was also used, perhaps in imitation of the Confucianists, in the writings of other schools of philosophy. Our present Lao Tzu is, he believes, a somewhat confused combination of a set of ancient philosophical admonitions and a later exegesis by someone called Lao Tzu, and this same pattern of basic text and later exposition may be seen in the Mo Tzu, Quan Tzu, and Han Fei Tzu. In a recent article, Professor Chen Shi Xiang reviews this early meaning of the word Chuan as an exegesis of an older and loftier text or tradition, and then continues to a discussion of the Shichi, remarking, "We know that in naming his biographies Chuan, Suma Qian was holding fast to the earlier sense of the word, that the individual lives he depicted were mere illustrations of the greater events and ideals of the times, and his Lie Chuan, therefore, stands in a subservient position to his imperial annals. Sik Penchi, in a sense not too different from that of the Kungyang Chuan to the spring and autumn annals. The division of material into five sections in the Shi Chi undoubtedly represents a certain judgment upon its relative importance, a hierarchical order established by the historian among the personalities of history. Sumachian's conception of history is basically political, and therefore men who dictated the fate of the empire can hardly stand side by side with obscure philosophers and country ruffians who wielded negligible political influence. In this sense, the Liuchuan are without doubt subservient to the Penqi. But I think Professor Chen's statement, by emphasizing the earlier meaning of the word Chuan, implies that Suma Chen made a qualitative, a basic moral distinction between the characters and events of his annals and those of his memoirs or biographies. The personalities of the sketches, Professor Chen continues, describing the Lie Chuan, look oblique and lopsided, the focal interest being elsewhere on a much larger panel overhead, which is the whole corpus of a general history of several millennia. The biographies do indeed appear oblique and lopsided, not because the historian's interest is elsewhere, I believe, but for other very definite reasons. The Chien often writes with greater interest, personal feeling, and even passion in his memoirs than he does in his annals. There was for him no such thing as a general history outside the lives of the individual men of history. The core of all his writing, annals, treatises, hereditary houses, and memoirs alike, is the life of the individual. In the course of these many lives, he discerned a few overall patterns, such as the ceaseless cycle of rise and decay. But he is happily free of trends, tendencies, movements, and similar vague concepts which so often today threaten to drive the individual out of the pages of history. Oh, that's a very interesting phrasing. In Suma Qian's time, the word Chuan was often used very loosely to designate any book not already designated as a classic, whether it had to do directly with the exegesis of a classical text or not. It meant, in other words, the teachings or traditions of a man or group of men. It was Suma Qian, as has been clearly recognized, who first made the word mean biography by calling his biographical chapters Chuan. But he also wrote chapters on the history of foreign peoples and lands, which he called Chuan. In these cases, we cannot, of course, speak of the biography of Korea, and therefore the English word biography represents only a partial translation of Chuan. We must, it appears, look somewhere between the old meaning of exegesis and the later meaning of biography to discover what Suma Qian had in mind when he adopted this term. Most pertinent, I believe, is Professor Hightower's suggestion that what Suma Qian meant by Chuan was the tales or stories handed down to him and his age concerning the lives of individuals and peoples. By adopting this meaning of tale, we may further suggest something of Suma Chen's own attitude toward the material contained in these chapters. In the first of his Lie Chuan, which serves as a general introduction to the whole section, Suma Qian again warns the reader, as he did in the first chapter of his history, that the writing of history is not a cut and dried affair, but a matter of doubt, danger, and choice. He first discusses several ancient legends of virtuous men who were supposedly offered the throne of the empire but declined it. He himself, he remarks, has seen what is said to be the grave of one of these men. Yet these stories, he notes, not only are not authenticated by the Confucian classics, the final judge of reliability, but are inconsistent with reason and good sense. Here he raises the first great dilemma of the historian, the lack of sufficient reliable sources. He proceeds to the story of Po I and Shu Qi, two men of ancient times, praised by Confucius for the fact that they did not bear grudges. But he continues, their story, Chuan, relates that, and he proceeds to tell their tale as he found it in his sources, which shows clearly that they bore long and bitter grudges indeed. Here he points out the great, sorry, sorry, he here points out the second great dilemma of the historian, the contradiction of sources. It is clear from his use of the word Chuan here that Qian had in mind the tales or legends told about men of ancient times, and in addition, that he was well aware that these old tales were sometimes of questionable authority. It is further clear from a reading of the Lie Chuan themselves that Suma Qian did not regard his chapters as full length biographies in our sense of the word. Many of the most important aspects of the subject's lives are dealt with in other sections of his history and not mentioned at all in the Lie Chuan. The classic examples of this are the stories of the famous ministers of Qi, Quan Chung, and Yan Ying, volume 62, in which most of the important aspects of their official careers and their teachings are ignored in favor of a few anecdotes illustrating their personalities. Qian did not believe it his duty to tell all he knew about the subject of his chapter, but only those incidents and anecdotes which would most clearly indicate the person's character and worth, the things that people had remembered and repeated about him. Since his stated aim was to rescue from oblivion the memory of great men of old, he felt it was sufficient if he recorded only their most outstanding and memorable points. In the case of persons of lesser importance, if he thought there was no danger they would be forgotten, he did not even bother to mention more than their names. Suma Qian was creating an entirely new literary form by writing chapters devoted specifically to the lives of individuals. If we are not to misjudge the success of his efforts, we must not be misled, I think, either by the old term Chuan to which he was trying to give new meaning, nor by what the Chuan or biographical form became in the hands of later writers. We can only decide what Qian intended the new form to be by examining what he himself did with it. If, as has been generally considered, the biographical form was a creation of Suma Qian, what, if any, were the sources and precedents for this new form? As Professor Chen points out, the editors of the Su Ku Chuan Shu Tsun Mu, chapter 57, trace the origin of the biographical form to a work probably of the 4th century BC, the Yan Tzu Chun Chiu, or Spring and Autumn of Master Yan. But this work, though containing a number of speeches and admonitions, supposedly by the famous minister of Qi, Yan Ying, is actually a philosophical work expounding policies associated with his name and anecdotes in which he figures. It cannot be regarded as a life of the man himself. If we are to consider it as a prototype of biographical writing, and it is certainly one step in that direction, We might go farther back and consider the Mencius and Analects, which do not differ basically from it in form as similar prototypes. But these early works are all characterized by a single objective. Their purpose is not to record the life of an individual, but to present his teachings, to set forth the doctrines of a school of thought. While we are indulging in this game of tracing things beyond their actual beginnings, however, we should take note of another possible ancestor of the biographical form and the concern for the life of the individual which it represents. This is the brave tale of Princess Po of Lu, recorded in the Spring and Autumn Annals and its commentaries. Page 125. In 582 BC, at the age of about 20, Princess Po, daughter of Duke Xuan of Lu, was married to Duke Kung, who had succeeded to the rule of Sung some 7 years before. In 576, 6 years after their marriage, Kung died and was succeeded by his son Cheng, who became Duke Ping. According to Tung Chung Shu, the princess, like a proper widow, went into retirement for the rest of her life. One night in 543, when she was around 60, the house where she was living caught fire. Her attendants urged her to flee, but the old woman, insisting that it was improper for a lady to venture out of her dwelling at night without a duenna, adamantly stayed where she was and burned to death. Although a few commentators have opined that, under the unusual and pressing circumstances, the princess might have disregarded the ordinary demands of propriety, most have agreed in naming her because of her noble act of sacrifice, a paragon of virtue. The important point in this tragicomic tale is that the Spring and Autumn Annals, in its brief chronicle, makes a total of 8 entries concerning the life of the princess. And although this may simply be because she was a native of Lu, both the Kungyang and the Kuliang commentaries, as well as Tung Chung Shu, all agree that the reason for the amount of space devoted to her affairs is that Confucius and the sources he followed wished to emphasize her virtue by recording her life in some detail. As a later commentator has remarked, in historiographical practice, there is detailed and abbreviated recording. Although we cannot examine today the most ancient histories from the time of Suma Qian and Pan Ku on, the comparative moral worth of various individuals determined the length and brevity of the narrative devoted to them. Princess Po displayed worthy action, and therefore the ancient historians made an especially detailed record of her life, and the sage followed this without change. Suma Qian had, of course, fairly detailed accounts of the lives of heroes and famous men already at hand in his early sources. Some of these, like the tale of the famous Chung Er in the Tso commentary or that of Su Qin in the intrigues of the warring states, were probably based upon early historical romances that had been handed down and added to through the centuries. It required no great labor to compile these early stories in the form of separate biographies. But as Chien makes clear in his chapter on Po I and elsewhere, he did not see himself simply as a teller of old tales. He believed he had a much more profound moral obligation to preserve for posterity the merits of the men of the past and to reward them for their trials and sorrows by conferring upon them, when they deserve it, the immortality of history. It is this deep felt moral aspect of Sumarchen's biographies that must, I think, lead us back to the brief, sad story of the Princess of Lu and her moment of glory. The influence which the tale of Princess Po and its interpretation in the Kungyang commentary had upon Suma Qian must be purely a matter of conjecture. Yet it is certain that somehow, for some reason, Qian created in his writing a new place for the individual in history. Works prior to his time had been content to treat only the great and outstanding deeds of the individual or weave his story into a larger narrative or an exposition of a particular school of thought. It was Suma Qian who first saw that the life story of the individual could be given independent existence and could reveal in its form and development a meaning larger than that of single deeds and different from schools of thought. Some of his Liachuan are, it is some of his Liachuan are, it is true, hardly more than recitals of a single great act of a man, but this may often have been due to a lack of other material. Certainly, the nearer to his own time his subjects come, the more complex and detailed are their stories. Again, his chapters dealing with philosophers are necessarily concerned largely with their ideas, as, for example, his biography of Zhou Yan, volume 74. But many of the Liachuan fit neither of these traditional patterns. They tell the story of the man of action, not only in his moment of glory, but from his youth, when he first dreamed of great deeds, to his death, when success was a memory of the past. Some century and a half before Plutarch in the West, Qian conceived the idea so natural to us today that we can hardly believe that it had to be thought of, that the life of the individual as well as that of the state or the age is a fit subject for the concentrated attention of the historian. We may point to the interest in lineages and genealogies that characterize the late Chow as a reason for Qian's attention to biography. We may recall the great social upheavals of the late Chow and early Han and the opportunities they afforded for the man of ability, regardless of birth, to rise in the world as a source of interest in and respect for the individual. But these are only factors contributing to a favorable atmosphere for Suma Qian's creation, not causes which made it inevitable. The act of creation is Suma Qian's, and we can attribute it only to that same mysterious leap of the imagination that is responsible for all true artistic innovations. The historian, as Suma Qian saw him, had two aims: to console the dead for their sorrows by handing on their story, and to instruct the living and unborn by means of these same stories in the ways of human life. He had learned from Confucius' own spring and autumn annals that the most profound and meaningful lessons of life were best conveyed in the stuff of human history. Parables were sometimes used in China as they were later to be used in the teaching of Jesus. But Confucius, Suma Chen believed, had shown that a judicial arrangement of the facts of the past taught men better and more truthfully. It was this method which Suma Chen, in his own search for the principles that govern human life, adopted. But in his Liachuan chapters, and indeed in his history as a whole, he focused not upon the history of the state, but upon the will and actions of the individual. It is hardly necessary to remark at this point that his interest was not in just any individual. The idea of the worth of the common man was as foreign to him as it was to his contemporaries in the West. To the thinker of the ancient world, East or West, the life of the common man told only what it is to be common, a thing which interested few people. It was not the mean of human capabilities, but the extreme which excited the interest of the historian and the philosopher, and it was for this reason that Suma Chen, as he himself explains, chose for his subjects only extraordinary men who accomplished extraordinary things. As we read his lives of these extraordinary figures of the Chinese past, we may ask what, if any, are the lessons that Qian would teach by them. The lesson seems to be only this: that the world is a fickle place in which virtue must be its own reward, for it may assuredly look in this life for reward from no other quarter. This is what he hints in his introductory chapter of the Lia Chuan, and what the following chapter substantiate with painful monotony. And yet, there is one thing that rescues the Li Chuan from futile pessimism, and that is the sympathy of Suma Qian himself. As he takes up each gloomy tale of the past, the love and understanding of the historian, in an act resembling religious salvation, rights all the injustices, assuages all the sorrow, and sets down in imperishable words the true form of the individual's life, where it may await the understanding of all sympathetic men of the future. One may object at this point that not all of Sumarchen's portraits are by any means kindly and lovable. This is, of course, true. He was no sentimentalist, but an historian with an historian's fearless gaze. He saw and recorded, even in the men he most admired, each flaw of character and error of judgment. For fickle though the world might be, he recognized that neither success nor failure is completely the result of environment. Had he, in his sympathy, whitewashed his heroes and idealized them into flawless paragons, he would have falsified his whole picture of life and deprived the reader of one of the most important keys to the hero's downfall, his own faults. But in every man he treated, he found merits, and it was these with which he sympathized, these which he felt made the story worth relating to future ages. On the other hand, no matter how important a man might be in actual history, if he were wholly without good points, Suma Qian chose as much as possible to ignore him. The eunuch Chow Kao wielded tremendous power at the end of the chain, and Suma Qian was forced to devote much space to his evil deeds and their influence in the biographies of other men. But he wrote no biography for Chow Kao. If good was to be rewarded by the perpetuation of its name, then the reward for evil was oblivion. Actually, Chow Kao appears in the pages of the Shichi, but formally and symbolically, he is condemned to this oblivion. In his biographies, Sumachian did not simply string out a series of individual lives, nor did he always, as one might expect, group his subjects by chronological or geographical affinities. He held strongly to the conviction, derived from the classics and philosophical writings of his past, that there are profound and unchanging moral patterns that underlie the course of human events. He followed chronological order where it was convenient, but he subordinated it to these patterns that he perceived in the lives of the men of the past. He classified his subjects into groups by the contour of their lives and the ambitions that motivated them, placing men of the same category in one chapter. Some of these categories were clearly enough defined to warrant a label, and so he wrote chapters entitled Assassin Retainers, Wandering Knights, Good Officials, Harsh Officials, etc. Others fell into groups by their similarity of interest: the philosophers, the doctors, the tragic poets. In other cases, the pattern is less obvious, the bond more subtle, or as some critics have objected, far fetched. Whatever we may think of these groupings of lives, we must recognize that in this very search for a pattern, the basic philosophy of history, which motivated Suma Qian and his countrymen, is revealed. The ages before Chen had created in history the types of the evil and the virtuous ruler, the upright and the wicked minister. The idea of patterns, the patterns themselves, were old in Suma Chen's day. It was he who perceived that they could be applied not only to the men of ancient history, but also to those of his own day. He took the old cardboard stereotypes of the past and made of them portraits of living men of flesh and blood. He discovered subtleties of shading that the old black and white caricatures had ignored. But he never abandoned the idea that there is a basic moral pattern to all human life, which determines its real meaning, the only meaning it has in history. Later Chinese historiographical writing, when it became the creation not of an individual but of committees of bureaucrats, disregarded this ancient meaning, writing biographies for all men who achieved a sufficiently high official rank, regardless of the true worth or interest of their life stories. But the Shichi tradition of writing biographies, not merely of men who were important in their own times, but of men whose lives exemplified a transcendent moral greatness, continued to exercise its influence in Chinese literature. Shortly after Suma Qian, and probably due to his example, there began to appear a number of biographical works such as Liu Xiang's Stories of Outstanding Women, Lie Nu Chuan, or Huang Fu Mi's 215 to 282 Stories of Eminent Men, Cao Shi Chuan, which were devoted to groups of individuals whose lives displayed the same moral pattern. This new genre, derived from the categorized types of the Shichi and Hanshu biographies, has continued to occupy a major position in Chinese biographical writing down to the present. Fortunately for us, however, Sima Qian did not, in his Liuchuan section, confine himself solely to the writing of individual lives. From his biographies of men of similar professions and interests, it was only a step to chapters relating the lives of men associated with foreign regions, native rulers, Chinese explorers, generals, and envoys who brought these lands into contact with China. So we have his invaluable accounts of non-Chinese peoples, which became the model for similar monographs in later Chinese histories. It had become the custom in preaching and early Han philosophical works to place at the end a chapter summing up the principles of the work as a whole and outlining the aims and makeup of the book. Suma Qian followed this practice by ending his history with a chapter setting forth his objectives in writing his work, listing its contents, and giving brief biographies of his ancestors, his father, and himself. This not only serves the valuable purpose of introducing the structure and purpose of his book, much as does the preface in a modern Western book, but aids our comprehension of the work by explaining, as modern prefaces generally fail to do, who the author himself is. This practice was fortunately adopted by many later historians, providing one of our most valuable sources for the history of Chinese historiographical thought. One more characteristic of the form of Shichi demands discussion. This is the judgment or appraisal with which Sima Qian ends most chapters of his history. Chinese historians have always attempted to achieve what Francis Bacon calls a naked delivery of facts with but a sparing use of private judgment. One may object that it is nothing but private judgment which tells the historian what the facts are and the way they are related. Without private judgment, he would have no facts to deliver. Yet, beyond this critical judgment, which we may assume underlies all historical writing, we find many historians, ancient and modern, interrupting their narrative to indulge in caustic comment or sighs of melancholy or to draw for the reader some pious moral. Interruptions of this kind have generally been condemned by the Chinese. Yet, realizing the value of such comments when aptly and appropriately made, Chinese historiography has dictated that they should be set aside by some conventional phrase or word which will warn the reader of their private nature and placed customarily at the end of a chapter. Numerous examples of such short passages of judgment and appraisal may be found in the Zhou commentary and the narratives from the states introduced by the conventional phrase Chun Zu Yue, the gentleman remarks. These supplied the model for Suma Qian's passages of personal opinion, which he used at the end or occasionally the beginning of his chapters to comment upon his subject. At present, these passages are all introduced by the words Tai Shi Kung Yue, the grand historian remarks. There have been a number of theories put forward to explain the use of this phrase. Some commentators believe that Suma Qian used it to honor his father, the grand historian Suma Tan, who may probably have written some of these sections. Yet, we know from internal evidence that in many cases they must have been written by Qian himself, and it would have been presumptuous of him, critics claim, to use the honorary appellation Tai Shi Kung when referring to himself. To avoid this difficulty, it has been suggested that the phrase The grand historian remarks was in all cases added by a later editor, either Tung Fang So or Qian's grandson, Yang Yun. Still another theory is that the phrase Tai Shi Kung is no more than an official title having no particular honorary connotation, and so Qian is within the bounds of modesty in referring to himself in this way. Whatever may be the explanation for the way the present Shi Chi text introduces them, the means to which Suma Chen put this little essay should be noted. At times, he follows the older convention of the Zhou commentary in introducing in these sections moral judgments upon the characters and events of his narrative, quoting sometimes from the classics to emphasize his point. But he did not confine himself to this practice. At other times, he supplements the narrative with new facts, discusses the reliability of his sources, explains his reasons for writing the chapter, or describes his own personal emotions and experiences as they relate to his subject. In other words, he uses the judgment form freely to make any type of comment he feels necessary or desirable. By setting these comments off clearly from the rest of the text, he allows himself to be as subjective and emotional as he likes without violating the historical objectivity demanded by Chinese custom. When Pan Ku adopted this form of the chief for his own work, he of course eliminated the verse, the grand historian, even when he was quoting verbatim from the Shi Chi, and substituted the word San. His choice of this word was unfortunate. He may in fact have intended it to mean a section which assists or supplements the narrative, but the term has generally been interpreted in its more common meaning of praise or eulogy, an inaccurate description of Panku's judgments, which, while they sometimes praise, as often condemn. Later historians set up two categories: the Ping or Lun, which they used, like Suma Qian, to discuss the reliability of their narrative, added new material, and judged the persons and events of the chapter, and the Chan of Panku, which they used for a brief summary or epitome of the subject. Following the tendency already evident in the table of contents of the Shi Chi, these epitomes were composed in four character rhymed phrases. The exact form of the Shi Chi in all its aspects has seldom been imitated by later historians. Although Panku adapted most of the formal divisions of the work of his predecessor, he made one vital change in its scope by limiting the range of his history to the span of one dynasty, the former Han. In doing so, Panku became the father of the Tuan Taishi or Shingle dynasty history form. The Han Shu, employing four of the five formal divisions of the Shi Chi, but with this important temporal limitation in the scope of its narrative, became the model for the later Cheng Shi or dynastic histories, also known as Chichuan or annual and memoir histories, because they invariably contained at least these two sections. Although there was at least one earlier attempt to write a comprehensive history on the scale of the Shi Chi, it was not until the Sung that any major work of history was produced that did not follow the single dynasty pattern laid down by the Han Shu. It is readily understandable why historians prefer to imitate the more amiable dimensions of Panku's history rather than attempt anything on the awesome scale of the Shi Chi. But the single dynasty form has one great fault which has long distressed Chinese philosophers of history. At least from Han times, the essence of human history, as of the whole natural world, was regarded by the Chinese as the phenomenon of change. All creation, whether in the heavenly, terrestrial, or human spheres, is constantly in a process of growth, waxing and waning, flourishing and dying, rising and falling. Therefore, to understand the world and human history, one must understand this process of change and know its direction at any given point in time. In human history, the greatest and most significant change is the fall of an old ruling house and the rise of a new one, and the greatest lesson that history teaches is how and why dynasties rise and fall, and how a ruler may preserve the health of his state. Thus, it is said of the spring and autumn annals that it preserves the states which are perishing because it imparts just this knowledge. But the dynastic history form, though it traces the rise and fall of one ruling house, does not fully encompass this all important process of change from the first signs of decay in an old dynasty to the final victory of a new. It begins its story when the old rule is already doomed and tottering and looks only far enough ahead into the history of the following dynasty to record the last dying gasps of its principal subject. Many Chinese historians have rightly felt that this arbitrary temporal division into dynastic periods does violence to the dynamic spirit of change, rending the living fabric of history and thereby obscuring the significant pattern written thereon. It was to preserve this significant continuity of history that the Sung historian Suma Qian and his associates undertook the writing of a mammoth account of the past from the year 403 BC to 959 AD. Their work, the Su Chi Tung Chien, a comprehensive mirror for the aid of government, has been considered the finest example of the Tung Shi or continuous history and is probably the best known and read of all Chinese histories after the Shi Chi. Cheng Xia 1108 to 1166, another Sung historian who produced a monumental history of the past modeled on the Shichi form, argues in the preface to his work that the history of a single dynasty is meaningless and without value unless it is seen in terms of the eras which preceded and produced it. He berates later historians for ignoring, in this respect, the excellent example of Suma Qian to follow that of Pan Ku, likening Qian to a dragon and Pan Ku to a pig. The same point is also made, without recourse to scurrility, by the last of the great Sung historians, Ma Tuan Lin, 13th century, who argues that although the single dynasty form may be acceptable for accounts of purely political history, because of its arbitrary divisions, it renders institutional and cultural history incomprehensible. The Chinese have thus not been blind to the theoretical advantages of the continuous history over the single dynasty form that most historians after the Han modeled their work on the Han Shu rather than the Shi Chi is more probably proof that all but the hardiest found themselves intimidated by the staggering scope and demands of the Shi Chi form. Okay, so there ends chapter 4 at page 134. Okay, let us see. Let's stop this. Okay, friends, I have been reading for long and now I need to rest for a while. So, here I will take some rest and then we'll continue again after a while.
ఏదో దాని చేసినవా
చలి అయిపోయింది నాకే.
సరే వస్తుందా కొంచెం ఉండేది అది అయిపోయిందా ఏమన్నా మాట్లాడది
అది అయిపోలేదు, కాసేపు రెస్ట్.
సరే అది అయిపోకుండా కానీ సరే వస్తాను. అది మాట్లాడేసినట్టు తింటావా? కూర్చుందా?
పొడవలేదా?